Slave owners received payment for releasing their slaves when slavery was outlawed in the United States. The state believed that slave owners might suffer since black slaves were viewed as properties and commodities. Thus, the Compensated Emancipation Act was signed by President Abraham Lincoln to return their money. For releasing their black slaves, slave owners received, on average, $300. But what about making up for all the horrors, atrocities, and brutalities that African American slaves had to endure? Black slaves labored under appalling conditions in plantations, white homes, and other settings for more than 250 years. They literally built and oversaw the infrastructure and economics of the United States. But they received no compensation. All the food they were offered was barely enough to sustain them. Who will make up for that? Without a doubt, the U.S. must compensate Black Americans whose ancestors went through unspeakable hardships. This subject has been postponed, hidden under layers of complexity, and presented as baseless for centuries. That won't happen anymore, though. In the U.S., slavery was a dehumanizing institution that regarded Africans and African Americans as goods that could be purchased, sold, or exchanged. People who were forced into slavery were brought to the U.S. by force in excess of 600,000, representing 5% of the 12 million Africans taken into slavery during the onset of the transatlantic slave trade in 1526. Slavery was prevalent in early colonial Britain, and this included the 13 colonies that would eventually make up the United States of America. In the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, Africans were kidnapped, forced into slavery in American colonies, and forced to perform arduous labor in the fields growing cotton and tobacco. Millions of slaves suffered cruel treatment and merciless exploitation as a source of free labor while being regarded as legal property in the United States over time. Their laborious efforts were instrumental in making the United States the leading nation in the world economy. Slaves were the single greatest financial asset in the U.S. economy in 1860, according to one historian, when their total worth was estimated at about $3.5 billion, or about $115 billion today. In the South, during the antebellum period, the percentage of people in slavery was approximately 13%. A significant number of them resided on expansive plantations or modest farms, with certain slave owners possessing no more than 50 enslaved people. The South experienced an economic crisis at the end of the 18th century as a result of the depleted land used for tobacco farming. With the country's westward expansion and the burgeoning abolitionist movement, the future of slavery in America became questionable. This finally sparked an intense discussion about slavery that resulted in the disastrous Civil War. Black Americans worked as slaves and produced enormous wealth for both their captors and the country at large. They did not, however, reap any of the rewards for themselves. It's interesting to note that, in recognition of the need for reparations at the time, the U.S. government ordered that all families that had previously been in slavery receive 40 acres of land and a mule, providing them with a chance to achieve prosperity and financial security. But after President Andrew Johnson took office, President Abraham Lincoln took a different stand. Field Order 15 was overturned by him, and he chose to give the land back to former slave owners rather than give black people the resources to support themselves. It was pure injustice, proof that racism and slavery dated back to the founding of the United States. In essence, the federal government gave the former slave owners more power. In Washington, D.C., for example, slave owners received compensation for the property that the former slaves represented that was lost. In neighboring states, this practice was also common. Due to their lack of other employment opportunities, a large number of African Americans ended up going back to work as sharecroppers on the land that had once belonged to their enslavers. Not only did slave owners benefit financially from the enslavement of African Americans, but they also made extra money from the land that the enslaved had to labor on. Black Americans were left without any kind of wealth or long-term means of subsistence, even after they were granted freedom. The wealth disparity that still exists today started with this. State governments in the former Confederate states pursued policies to impose racial segregation and take away black citizens' ability to vote following the American Civil War. Their objective was to hinder conversations between African American and white people in public areas. Black codes and Jim Crow laws were enacted at different times throughout the southern United States to accomplish these goals. Many black people had been enslaved before 1855, when black codes were first implemented in several states, severely restricting their rights. These codes placed severe limitations on the kinds of jobs that African Americans could be employed in, as well as their ability to leave jobs once they were hired. Furthermore, certain states placed restrictions on the types of property that black people were allowed to own. Black people were required by the black codes to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they ran the risk of being arrested, fined, and forced to perform unpaid labor. A large number of black men participated actively in politics during the Reconstruction era by casting ballots and running for office. However, more discriminatory laws were passed by Southern states after Reconstruction was formally ended in 1877. As legislative efforts to maintain white supremacist practices intensified, African Americans began to use the legal system to pursue justice. Regretfully, the results of these endeavors were depressing in 1896, as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of facilities that are separate but equal, which includes schools and public transportation. Segregation and discrimination were not only accepted by law, but also actively practiced during that time until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Segregated seating in movie theaters, hotels, and restaurants, as well as in certain cases, outright denial of service, were among the social, economic, and legal forms of discrimination experienced by African Americans. That is why the first edition of the travel guide, Negro Motorist Green Book, was released in 1937. African American tourists could use this guide as a resource to find places where they would be guaranteed impartial and equitable treatment. The quality of education that African American children received during this era differed significantly from that of their white peers due to segregated public schools. With their outdated or worn-out textbooks, underpaid teachers, and inadequate facilities and supplies, these schools purposefully provided a lower quality education. Black Americans' unwavering perseverance in pursuing financial independence persisted in the face of these obstacles. Black Americans held a large number of homes, farms, and city properties prior to the 20th century. In Tulsa, a city known for its predominantly wealthy black populace, there was, in fact, a vibrant Black Wall Street. However, some white people's prejudice, hatred, and jealousy increased along with the wealth of black people. The government, along with some white Americans, went to tremendous measures to undermine the accumulation of wealth among the black community. White people who were jealous of black people's increased wealth and possessions turned to violence and other terrible deeds in order to maintain the idea of white supremacy. Between 1865 and 1965, there were over 3,000 recorded lynchings, according to organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Tuskegee Institute. Landowners made up a large number of those who perished in these horrifying crimes, which aimed to eradicate black wealth, seize black-owned property, and maintain white supremacy. Ordinary white citizens were not the only ones who committed lynchings. This violence was actually encouraged and approved by some white officials. When these lynchings first started, they mostly targeted single families, but in some cases, whole black communities were destroyed. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma was tragically destroyed in 1921, and the racial cleansing of Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, are two prominent examples. Black landowners were essentially forced to flee their own country as a result of intense pressure from the government and other populace to give up their land. Another technique for stealing land from its legitimate owners was through tax sales. The majority of these landowners were black people who wanted to hang on to their land. They were unable to pay the yearly property taxes, though, because they frequently had fixed incomes. When these families neglected to pay their taxes, the government auctioned off their properties, and developers often took advantage of the situation to buy land these families didn't want to sell. Another tactic used to stifle black wealth and prevent its advancement was redlining. America's housing stock was to be expanded and segregated through a program started by the federal government in 1933. African Americans and other people of color were routinely kept out of newly constructed suburban communities and directed toward urban housing projects, with the main goal of this program being to provide housing for white middle-class and lower middle-class families. Redlining is a term that was first used to describe a federal government-instituted practice during the New Deal era basis. Really, property values tended to rise when African Americans tried to purchase homes in predominantly white or all-white neighborhoods. Because they had fewer housing options, African Americans were willing to pay more for properties, which increased demand in turn. The federal housing policies that were put into place during the 20th century are largely to blame for the significant wealth gap that exists today between white people and African Americans. Although African American earnings constitute approximately 60% of the average white income, African American wealth is only 5% of the total white wealth. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like and share the video, and watch more videos about Black identity, history, and culture. Now let's proceed. The equity in their homes is the primary source of wealth for the majority of middle-class families in the United States. Consequently, these federal housing policies are primarily responsible for the notable disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio. The FHA's prohibition on African American families buying homes in suburban areas in the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 1960s prevented them from taking advantage of the equity appreciation that white families enjoyed. Homes in the late 1940s and early 1950s were priced at about twice the national median income in communities like Levittown and Daly City, California, and other similar developments across the country. For working-class families with FHA or VA mortgages, these homes were within their means. Like their white counterparts, African American families were financially capable of purchasing these homes, but they were wrongfully denied the opportunity. The prices at which these identical homes are sold these days frequently range from $300,000 to $400,000, which is 6 or 8 times the national median income. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made it possible for African Americans to buy homes in the suburbs, but by then many black families were unable to afford them. White families, on the other hand, kept buying these houses and profiting from the equity and ensuing wealth accumulation. White families achieve financial independence by funding their children's college education and providing for their aging parents with their home equity, so they are not dependent on their descendants. For the most part, African Americans were excluded from the benefits that come with becoming homeowners and building wealth. A historical fact that has contributed to the large wealth disparity that still exists between black and white families is the fact that they were frequently unable to buy homes in suburban areas. There is no indication that this gap will close anytime soon. To make matters worse, African Americans start out with less money than their white counterparts and also have more obstacles to overcome in order to move up the economic ladder and experience financial setbacks more frequently. In the United States, the median wealth of black households was $24,100 in 2019, compared to $18,100 for white households. In other words, the average black household owned only 12.7% of the average white household's wealth, leaving a $165,000 wealth deficit. When expressed in absolute dollar amounts, the average wealth gap appears significantly more significant, even though it may appear somewhat smaller in relative terms. Compared to the average white household's wealth of over $980,000 in 2019, black households had an average wealth of just over $142,000. This means that in terms of absolute dollars, black households own less than 14.5% of white households' wealth. This difference exceeds $838,000. A discriminatory economic system that routinely prevents black households from realizing the American dream is the primary cause of the ongoing wealth gap between black and white Americans. There has long been a significant and persistent racial wealth gap because this system has historically made it extremely difficult for black families to accumulate and maintain capital. Black households face significant obstacles to accumulating wealth, which have existed for centuries and continue to be a fundamental problem. It is becoming more and more unlikely that black Americans will surpass their white counterparts without significant public interventions due to the self-perpetuating nature of wealth accumulation. White households have a significantly higher likelihood of receiving substantial inheritances from their parents and grandparents, which are frequently significantly larger than those received by black households, following centuries of oppression and systemic barriers to wealth creation. Furthermore, white households typically have greater access to affluent and expansive social networks, which opens up employment and career opportunities for them, as well as their children. Taking on the deeply embedded institutions that have historically prevented black households from accumulating and expanding wealth at the same rate as their white counterparts is necessary to close the persistent wealth gap between black and white Americans. At this point, the idea of reparations is brought up. It is not novel to propose reparations as a way to make up for the historical injustices that African Americans have experienced. Debate, activism, and legislative action have all been centered around it. Proposals for a long time. A well-known illustration is the H.R. 40 bill, which has been proposed throughout the Congress in different sessions since 1989. The Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, as the bill is officially named, outlines its objectives. In order to investigate the long-term effects of discrimination and slavery and develop potential remedies in the form of reparations, it aims to form a commission. In spite of several introductions, the H.R. 40 bill has not yet been signed into law, highlighting the difficulties and complexities involved in the reparations debate. In a diverse and frequently divided society, the matter brings up important issues regarding the proper means of redress, the procedures for putting them into practice, and the overall importance of addressing past injustices. Reparations, according to proponents, are necessary to make up for the psychological, social, and economic damages that successive generations of black Americans have suffered, as well as to acknowledge the lasting effects of systemic discrimination and slavery. The United States endured a traumatic past spanning more than 250 years, characterized by periods of violent slavery, Jim Crow laws, housing discrimination, black codes, and other institutionalized forms of racism. There is a startling disparity in wealth between white and black households in the nation as a result of all of these historical factors. In contrast to the median black American in their late 50s, the median white American in the final decade of the 19th century was 250 times wealthier. Even though the white-to-black wealth ratio began to decline more slowly, it took an additional 50 years for the gap to close to half again. The emergence of discriminatory laws and policies impeded the social, political, and economic advancement of black people. Black people had a hard time saving money, investing it, and building wealth because they were underpaid and had limited access to capital. Reparations is a contentious topic of discussion. There are those who contend that reparations might not be a sufficient solution to the problems caused by past injustices, and propose that other strategies like funding for healthcare, education, and employment opportunities might be more effective. Reparations opponents voiced concerns about eligibility issues and the possibility of further dividing the country, whether compensation should be granted to descendants of black Americans who can prove their ancestry to slavery, or to all black Americans. Furthermore, since no one alive today is accountable for historical injustices like slavery, they challenge the idea that taxpayer money should be used to pay for reparations. William Darity, an economist and co-author of the book From Here to Equality, which lays out a detailed plan for material reparations, is adamant that the best way to address the historical and contemporary wealth disparities in America is through reparations aimed at narrowing the racial wealth gap. Darity estimated that in order to reach this target, each qualified beneficiary would need to pay about $350,000. About 47 million Americans who identify as Black would receive direct payments under Darity's proposal. Individuals would have to identify as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for a minimum of 12 years prior to the implementation of the reparations plan in order to be eligible. They would also have to show proof that they had at least one ancestor who was a slave in the U.S. Census records can be used as one means of proving this lineage. An ancestor is presumed to have been enslaved if they are found in the 1870 census and were old enough to have been alive in 1850 or 1860, but are absent from the earlier census records. This is because, prior to the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery, those who were enslaved were not counted in the census. Even though Darity's plan has received support, there are those who oppose it, especially when it comes to whether or not certain Black communities and Caribbean immigrants should be eligible for government-funded reparations. Notwithstanding these divergent points of view, the demand for reparations to address the severe injustices that Black African Americans experienced as a result of slavery, racial discrimination, and hatred is a moral and social obligation. It is impossible to ignore the historical proof of centuries of systematic oppression and suffering. Even though different people have different opinions about reparations, it is important to understand that these policies can help heal the rifts in our society that have long existed. This includes improving housing, healthcare, and educational opportunities for Black people. The state and the federal government of the United States, however, have taken no meaningful action to make restitution. The Black Americans are the citizens of the United States, and obtaining restitution is their right, which needs to be granted. Detailed plans are already presented, yet various governments just touched on the topic and left it when they got enough fame through it. Perhaps Black Americans should ensure that they get a guarantee before electing any president that reparation will be made. A study in the review of the Black Political Economy Journal reports that if all the factors of slavery are taken under consideration and monetary equivalent is calculated, the U.S. owes approximately $151 million to every Black American. Now you can understand why the U.S. does not discuss this matter. Even if $151 million is not paid, at least $350,000 has to be paid to every Black American. Do you think Black Americans should be paid the reparation money? Isn't it true that no matter how much this subject is delayed, reparation has to be made as it is inevitable? Let us know how Black Americans should demand reparation in a way that is noticeable, and the state is left with the only option to pay it. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching.